Hello, this is Chris with Phoenix Gaming, and today we're going to talk about how you can get your points with Drukhari. We all know that they're kind of in a rough spot competitively, so we're going to go over some things that you can do to make sure you're getting the points you need in your games. We're going to briefly touch on whether I prefer fixed or tactical, and then we're going to talk about the best options for fixed. And I'm sure you can already tell which way I lean personally. From a competitive standpoint, I prefer fixed objectives because I have more control over what I can or can't score. I have more control over where I get my points. It does allow me for better game planning, and there are definitely some fixed options that we as an army can score well. However, if you do choose to use tactical, I do think it's a more fun way to play. And the mobility that Drukhari has does kind of lend to the shifting objectives of tactical cards. So, if you want a fun way to play that we as an army can actually play into, tactical is a good way to do it. Just from a competitive standpoint, like if I go to a tournament, I'm probably taking fixed most games simply because I like being able to control where my points come from, how I get them, and being able to kind of game plan what it is I'm doing. So the ability to cycle cards in tactical will help keep you scoring. You can discard one at the beginning of your turn, or you can discard one at the end of your turn. So you have ways to continuously cycle cards. So that's also there for you. Now, for the fixed missions, those are the easiest to build around and score, right? If you're going to pick your secondaries, you can build lists that are tailored to accomplishing those secondaries. And then the only way you're not going to score your points is if your opponent just is better at preventing them than you are at scoring them. So again, it puts a lot more control into your hands. The easiest ones to score, the first one out of the easiest to me is engage on all fronts. We have a lot of speed, we have inherent deep strike units, and so you can continuously be filtering units into the table quarters. And that means you can get a minimum of 10 points on this pretty easily. And really, 12 to 15 is extremely feasible with careful play. Okay, so if we're set up for this mission, and this is our deployment zone, obviously we can get the engage on all fronts early and easy. We could put a venom over in this area, hop it here. We could put something here and put it here. And really, you only have to be 3 inches into the table quarter, so you just have to get past that line right there, which is going to be very easy because all of our units move at least 7 inches. So it's very easy for you to stage yourself for it in this mission. So again, it's one of those where this is one of the easier ones to get it. If this is your deployment zone, again, gonna be real easy. You can still hop. You can actually start with it over here. And depending on, what your deployments and your enemy's deployments look like, you can actually hide a unit over here. If they don't have something that's incredibly high range and they put it out here, you don't have to worry about this big lane here. Now, obviously, if you're playing against an army like Tau or, something with a lot more range, like a Space Marine, maybe they got like a Whirlwind or something just kind of camped. And really, the Whirlwind's indirect, so it doesn't matter where it's at. But it just means, if you save this unit or this little pocket for last, you can maybe throw a small footprint unit there and then just have something sitting there farming you points the whole game. Now, if this is your deployment zone, this one's going to be a little bit tougher, and you're probably not getting it turn one, at least not easily. Now, you just might be sacrificing a couple units in order to do it. Because what you could do is if you've got a Venom, you could deploy your Venom very aggressively here. You can fly it, it moves 14. Remember, this distance is 12. So you can fly it up, and then you can deploy your Cabalites just outside of it after it moves. So you could get it turn one, and you could get all 4 quarters turn one if you wanted to be really aggressive with it. However, when you do that, you're going to be setting yourself up for losing that unit, because if your opponent has guns, they're just going to shoot it. But if you're playing like a Blood Angels army, it's just getting charged. So if you do that, you really want to make sure you have countercharge units that are ready to go, right? You're going to want maybe some Incubi or something melee like Hellions even back here that can just come up, tag it, and then just play that trade game, right? And that's how we play this game, is it's a trade game for us. So, you're going to be sending units off to their death when you have this deployment zone and you take engage. So you're going to want to make sure you're maximizing those trades. And they may not kill the Venom, they may not kill both units, and that's a win for you. It's just one of those where you've got to be prepared for that interaction. If this is your deployment, obviously we can start almost in 3/4 again, because you can have a unit here, you can have a unit back here that can't be seen, and obviously you can have one back here that can't be seen. Um, you know, and a lot of these are going to be pretty close to objective markers, so you can actually hold objectives and just kind of fish for your engage on home fronts as well. It's going to be pretty easy. Again, we can turn one, move these guys, and then you've got 3 table quarters. Turn one, you should really only be focused on those 3 table quarters. You shouldn't be focused on 4. There's no reason to overextend yourself. I am a big fan of playing half the board with this army at a time and not trying to play the whole board. And we'll talk about that towards the end of the video. I think Cleanse is another fairly easy one to score. Again, because we have mobility, it's going to be pretty easy to get 10 points on. You're going to get 2 points for one objective, 4 points if you cleanse 2 objectives in a single turn. I do think getting 15 to 20 can be difficult because we just get picked up too fast. Enemy Overwatch will definitely do a lot more damage to our army than it will to other armies, and Indirect can keep us from camping, although thankfully GW did just release the data slate, and while the changes were minimal, anything with towering and anything with Indirect basically got jacked up in points. You'll want broken up squads of Cabalites or Witches. A brick of Racks with a Homunculus can camp a little bit better than people expect, especially if you can get them in a spot where your opponent has to work to try to shoot them. And then remember, units with assault weapons can advance and still do things like cleanse and teleport homers. So, like your Cabalites have assault rifles, they can advance and do it. Small units of Hellions are great because they have 14 inches of movement. They fly. And then the assault means they can cover a lot of ground and still get to objectives. So it's one of those where you have a lot of options here. This is where I would consider maybe 2 5-man Hellion squads, not for their damage output, but for their utility. Don't get me wrong, their damage output will be enough to make enemy infantry respect them, but it's not going to be so much that you could charge them into like a dreadnought and do a bunch of damage. Okay, we know this isn't to scale and it's not perfect, but if this is our setup, right, we just need to cleanse. It's not going to be that hard to get one in turn one. Again, if we have a Venom, we know that to this spot right here, from here to here, is within range of the Venom because it's only an 8-inch distance this way. So you don't even necessarily need the Venom. But if you move a Venom, you can move it behind the footprint here, or on the footprint, I should say. These footprints are actually pretty big. And then you can disembark your Cabalites after it moves, and then you can cleanse. Now, your Venom is susceptible to any kind of enemy shooting that can see it, like through this little gap here. But that's okay. And you are susceptible to getting charged if your unit has, or if your opponent has an assault unit there, like a melee unit. You are susceptible to that as well. But that's why we just throw 5 Cabalites on there, right? And you can even do that in a way so that you could move your Venom up, kind of roadblock them, and then put the Cabalites behind, and then have the Venom do it so that they have to charge the Venom first and not the Cabalites, and then still have your Cabalites to be able to come in, shoot, or do whatever. So you're going to have some options there, but really we're just looking at, can we score points? Now, the middle one's going to be pretty easy to get also. I would be very careful about doing it unless you just have some throwaway units. Again, if you've got like a 5-man of Cabalites just foot slogging, I would just advance them up there, cleanse that middle objective. If you can get this one and then either one of the flanks in the first turn, that might be worth, especially if you can set up those counter charges if your opponent's playing a melee army. If they're playing a shooting army, you're just sending units out to die. And that's okay, because if you're scoring points, you're winning, right? If you're able to get 4 points every turn because they won't come out and touch the middle of the board, then just keep feeding the middle of the board with as cheap units as you can. Now, when I played this last time I took cleanse, I actually ended up sneaking a unit of homunculus here and then coming in here. And then I just had those homunculus for 2 straight turns cleansing. Now, I did end up getting charged at some point. I was playing a Tau player, and he charged me with his ghost keel, and then he used that to just tie me up, which was fine. I didn't care. I have a pistol, so I'm still eligible to shoot, so I could just sit there and do it. Plus, I'm still getting engaged. But it really ended up hurting him because what it did was slowed him down so that I could have Lilith and then other like Lilith and her squad of witches come in, tag this unit that was out here, and then his Tetras just evaporated. So it's one of those where overall, I think it was a misplay by him. But had he not done anything, I would have been getting free points, free points, free points. So I understand why it was done that way. Just don't think it was necessarily the best way to do it. So we're not going to go through all of these, right? It's one of those where I'm just trying to show you a few examples of how we could do it. So here, I would probably place a Venom with 5 Kabalites. And I might consider one depending on what my opponent's army looks like. I might consider one here, but probably not. I feel like that's too exposed. More likely here. And again, if I want to try to get 2, I can throw the Venom up. Because the way these are set up, you actually have a lane here. And you should have the movement anyway to just fly over this wall. But even if you don't, you have this little lane here, and then you can disembark your Kabalites. And again, you have this lane here, and you can disembark your Kabalites. And what that does is that gives you the potential to do 2. You could take witches and put them in your Venoms also. Again, they're going to die. When you put them here to do cleanse, they're going to die, and that's okay. And honestly, what I would do is probably put the other 5 here and then advance them here and then try to get them up for the next turn. Because really all you're doing is you're just sending 1 to 2 units to the objective. Your opponent's probably going to shoot them off or charge them off. Either way, you're just trying to make sure you can get at least 2 points every turn with this secondary, because over 5 turns, that's 10 points. Now, if you're already got a secondary where you're scoring at least 10 points, then obviously this isn't the one for you. But I have found so far, I have not been able to score less than 10 points. Like my opponent has tried. So yeah, you're just going to feed them 1 at a time. If you can get 2, then get 2, but you want to use your cheapest units possible, or you might want to just throw a Venom on there to do it, because again, if the Venom is empty, who cares? It's going to die. You're just focused on scoring. Like I said, we're not going to go through every deployment zone for this. I just wanted to show you a few. So now we're going to talk about fixed objectives that are pretty easy, but I don't think they're necessarily as easy as the ones we talked about before. And that's going to be deploy teleport homers. That's going to be the first one. It is actually pretty easy to score. The downside is that I do not play the middle of the board with Drukhari. I just don't. I don't know if it's the right way to play, but it is how I play. I tend to only play the flanks, and I just give my opponent the middle of the board. I don't want it. Just because I don't have staying power, so if I'm in the middle of the board, it's too easy for my opponent to focus fire on me. I do like Hellions and Reavers being able to sneak into deployment zones to do this objective because they can advance and deploy homers. I feel like those are both very good units, especially the Hellions. You can take a 5 model unit, it's 10 wounds. So they're going to be able to stay on the table a little bit longer. And like I said, they can kind of sneak in there and do it. Certain matchups are going to be tough to do homers against, just because there are certain missions are going to be tougher. You know, anybody with a lot of indirect, but again, that's just an issue we have anyway. But they can indirect and overwatch, and it's one of those where certain armies are just going to be able to still squad wipe you if they have a high enough volume. Thankfully, again, Desolator squads went way up in points, so that's going to be something we have to worry about a little bit less. Scourges in Deep Strike can do it, but generally speaking, you're not going to want to forfeit their shooting unless it just makes more sense to get the points. And again, Scourges can also take Heat Lances, which are assault, so they'll also be able to advance and shoot or do the Homer secondary. They also have a 6-inch move after they shoot. So you've got some versatility there. Again, what I would say is Scourges should be your last option. You should have other options for this. You should have those Hellions. You should have the Cabalites in your Venoms and things of that nature. You need these cheaper units to go and do this to free up your heavier hitting units to be able to continue to play the game and shoot. Behind enemy lines is going to be one that is going to be a little bit tougher because we don't have advance and charge anymore outside of one unit. Witches and a lot of the dedicated melee really lost some of its punch, and then some of the movement shenanigans that could happen in the charge phase of 9th edition are gone. So if I charge you, I don't just get 6 inches of free movement even if I've killed you, right? So a lot of that's gone. So I do think behind enemy lines is going to be a little bit tougher. You still have it, and you still can use it. It can just suck a lot of resources, and that's going to be an issue as well. But we will actually do a couple of quick drawings on this one just to kind of show you ways you can make sure you get it. So generally speaking, this is going to be one of the harder deployment zones to get it in because the deployment zone is so short and it's easy to block people out of it, right? But you do have your fire and fade strat, which is going to help you. And again, Scourges, you could move them. This is about 12, so you could actually get them right about here. And then if you have a target to shoot at, you can shoot at it. They'll get to move another 6. And then at the end of the shooting phase, you can still use your fire and fade strat to move them another 14. So you'll actually be able to get 34 inches of movement with your Scourges. It's going to cost you 2 command points to do it. You can also still advance them, right? So you can get them their 14. If you get another 3 for advance and then another 6 after they shoot, you can still full move them and really just be able to kind of hide them a little bit better. Unfortunately, Scourges are one of the few units you can get that type of interaction with. Hellions you can as well. Again, you can boom, shoot, but they don't move again. You'll have to strat move them. But they can advance, and because they're splinter pods or assault, they can advance and still be eligible to shoot. So you can shoot with them. You can still fire and fade with them anyway. Like they just have a lot of utility. And then if you're doing that, you can actually just pop something in the middle to do homers. If you've got Scourges, you could have them there and something come towards the middle to do homers. Cleanse is another good one. So behind enemy lines is one of those that stacks well with other objectives. It's just going to be a little bit more hungry for your resources than some of the other secondaries will. And that's why I say it's a little bit harder, because you're going to want that fire and fade strat a lot more often, and that costs 2 command points. So it's one of those where you're going to be feeding command points into the secondary, and that's going to take them away from other places. So not that it's bad or not that you can't score it, it's just you're going to be starved for resources in other places because you don't really have a lot that's going to generate command points outside of the Archons. I think it's the enhancement on a 4-up, you get 1 refunded. The following, I think, are situational at best, and really it's just one of those where they always have been. Bring it down. I wouldn't take that unless I'm playing against buggy orcs or sentinel guard or maybe, a bunch of crisis suits. Things where they're not as high toughness, so I can still feasibly kill them in both shooting and melee. Where I've struggled with killing vehicles has been Wraith Knights, where they're T12, and the only things I can really put into them that are going to reliably wound them are Heat Lances. Because I want to bring Haywire and I want to bring Heat Lances. I don't want to just have one or the other. The Haywire has better volume and will consistently do more damage to vehicles. The Heat Lance is a more versatile weapon, but it's less shots. So it's one of those where I try to bring both, and I know people were talking about Dark Lances, and again, Dark Lances are a fine weapon. I am not saying there's anything wrong with them. I'm just telling you what my preference is. Dark Lances could also work very well. Again, where I see Dark Lances struggling is if you hit like a Leman Russ heavy guard list or Wraith Knights or regular Knights, and you have a bunch of T12 and T13 where you're wounding stuff on 4s and 5s. To me, that's where the Dark Lances are going to struggle. I do think Talos are probably going to get a points hike. They dodged one in this data slate, and I think it's just because Drukhari is kind of sucking ass right now. So because they're not doing well, they just overlooked it. But I would expect in the fall data slate, if lists don't diversify a bit more, the Talos will probably get a points hike. We'll probably see some drops on a few units. So it may end up being about the same, but it's one of those where I just try not to lean on something too hard because, man, when everybody leans on a unit too hard, that's the unit that's going to get nerfed. Assassinate, you can score well, but it does rely on a heavy character build. Certain armies like Marines, if they have character heavy lists, you can have a lot of stuff that's just hard to shift with a 3-up save, a 5-up feel no pain, maybe an invuln. Precision is limited to only a few units, like Rax and Drazar, for example. So it's one of those where you don't necessarily have a way to reliably kill characters, maybe put some chip damage on them outside of Drazar's once per game. I would not take Assassinate unless you plan on tabling people. And while I'm sure this army is capable of it, it's not the way I'm going to focus on playing it because I don't think it can do it reliably in a tournament setting. You just have too much of a variety of opponents, so I'm not going to bank on tabling people. Generally bad would be storm hostile objectives. We're really susceptible to indirect and Overwatch, as I've said ad nauseum. So sneaking onto objectives can be hard. Knocking your opponent off of every objective can also be extremely tough. This can be done, but it's just there are so many easier, better options to get your points. You could play storm hostile objectives. I just don't think it's the easiest way to play this army. And by easy, I don't mean like the army's easy to play, but if I'm taking fixed secondaries, I want things that I can plan around scoring. And storm hostile objectives is a little bit harder to plan around because your opponent has more control over your scoring with this one. Because they could just not take objectives, right? They could sit in their deployment zone, depending on what your mission rules are, get a handful of primaries, and just not take objectives and shut off your whole secondary. And then, depending on what their secondary is, they could still score points. So, storm hostile objectives to me is not one that I would bank on scoring reliably. I would have to really get a lot of practice in it. Like, it is a very finesse secondary. And especially with such a paper mache lightweight army, I'm just not planning on it. I'm not planning on taking an objective or 2 or 3 from you. Um, I'm just going to go where I can. I'm going to take the ground you give me, and we're going to build on that. So again, I don't think it's a terrible secondary. I just don't think it's worth the amount of effort that you need to put into it to get your points when you can get some easier points by taking different options. We're going to go into some takeaways, and then I'm going to talk to you about what I had said earlier about splitting the board in half, and I'll explain that a little bit. I talked about it quite a bit in 9th edition, so we're going to talk about it here a little bit, and then I will do a whole video breaking down how we can do it with all the different deployment zones and how we can play it. Overall, I think Drukhari can play either fixed or tactical. I prefer fixed, like I said before. I like being in control of how and what I score, and I don't want it to put it up to chance, and I don't want to put it in my opponent's hands because they're just going to do what they can to keep me from scoring. I do think Hellions and Reavers have a lot of utility besides their damage output. You could put Hellions and or Reavers into lists and really just reliably score some of these secondaries like Cleanse or Homers. Homers, if you're only planning on getting 10 points, I think Homers is the better take. If you want to try to get more points, I think Cleanse is the better take. And again, it's going to be mission dependent. With the way the missions work in 10th edition, and I'll do a video on that too. We'll do a whole video on how to use the tactical objective cards and how to pick your missions. And we'll talk about how we do it for a GT and how we do it for not a GT. So we'll go over that also. And remember, enemy Overwatch can just wipe squads. Points hikes to indirect units should help tone some of that down. Points hikes to towering units should help tone some of that down. Unfortunately, you Craft Worlds players out there, you're going to be kind of sad because of the Strands of Fate nerf, but we all saw it coming in some way, shape, or form. So I don't think anybody is too surprised by that getting here. Now, before we shout out the patrons, let's go ahead and talk about splitting the board in half. And Chris, what do you mean by that? Okay, so if this is our starting table, I might have a unit here and here and here and here, right? I'll deploy in a way to prevent deep strikes. But when I start to move forward, I'm not moving here, 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 and here. Because that gives me, that spreads me out too far, right? I have too much. What I will do is I might, and again, I might put a unit here and a unit up here. And honestly, and again, this is one of those where your opponent and your mission are going to dictate so much of this, but I might put something here and then just leave this here. But if you notice, there's nothing in the middle of the board. Like I said earlier, I just don't fuck with it. I don't mess with the middle of the board. It's not where I want to be when I use this army. And other people may have better success playing the middle of the board. I have just found what works for me is to not. So this right here could be anything, right? It could be racks, it could be witches, it could be right here, homunculus, whatever. It could be a venom, it could be a raider, it could be a ravager. A ravager would actually be a very good unit to put back here and hide, especially if you go first. And then when your opponent is going to have to do is they're going to have to decide if they want to poke out. Because like if it's a ravager, it'll do a lot of damage. So they have to go, okay, do I want to poke something out and potentially get it shot at? And if they do, that's fine. If they don't, that's also fine. But what I've found, I'm just starting to cut this board in half is what's happening. And with these here, depending on what they are, I have enough mobility that if I get my opponent to overcommit, I can start swinging around like this. Or if they've given me soft targets and there's not really a downside, I can start meeting them. And then bringing this over and bringing this over. And I can just vacate this whole area here and start sweeping all the way across, right? So what'll end up happening is that these units here will start sweeping this way, and then my whole army just kind of does this. And I've used this strategy very effectively. The only times I haven't been able to really effectively use it is late in ninth when every Marine player just had like 20 to 30 desolation squads or models on the table, because then the terrain didn't matter. They were just like, well, I'm just going to sit here in my deployment zone. I'm going to hit on threes, re-rolling, and I'm just going to make you pick up your army. Like, I can't do anything about that. I can't outmaneuver it. I can't change it. So I just have to, approach it a little bit differently. But that's been the only time I haven't had that strategy work. I did play against one of the top Tyranid players in the country, and that strategy worked against him. I committed over here. He sent his Hive Tyrant and his Tyrant Guard and a bunch of stuff there to meet what I had committed over here. And then once he got stuck behind a building, I just swept around that way in a wide circular arc and just proceeded to squish the rest of his army while his big heavy hitting melee stuff was kind of stuck foot slogging it and trapped behind a building. So that's what I mean by cutting the table in half. I'm only basically playing half of this table. I will deploy, I will look at how my opponent deployed, and then I will plan on whether or not I'm playing the left half or the right half. And with our mobility being what it is, I can at least change that turn 1 or turn 2 without too much detriment. Later in the game, it gets a little harder. The Fire and Fade strat will help you change that as well, so you have some options. So that's where I'm coming from when I say that, just so everybody understands it. When I say cut the board in half, that's what I mean, and it does work. I have had it work very well. Okay, big shout out to the Immortals, Captain Too Tall, the real Donnie G, Lord Wellingstone, and Daniel Bodecker. I appreciate the support, guys. Again, we've gotten so much more terrain. I'm running more and more events. We're doing a comp league. We're doing a tournament at the end of the month. We just did an apocalypse event. So the events keep coming. I am running them. I love it. I love getting the support from the community. I also love getting the support from the community with the subscriptions. We've gone up over 100 subscriptions in less than a month on the YouTube channel, and that is because you guys are awesome. So again, big thank you to you. Links on the screen and in the description. And I just want to give a big shout out if you want to know some marine tactics, there's a recommended channel in my page called Danklists. He does a lot of Dark Angels stuff, so that will kind of give you some insight as to what Dark Angels and Marine players are kind of looking at. And then of course Proxy Hammer, big shout out to him because Homeboy has done nothing but support, and I love supporting him back. So it's great that we're just building a bigger YouTube-based community as well as just a 40K community. I appreciate all of you. Thank you a lot.